Every great thinker throughout the course of human history has had something to say about happiness.
This is the question that Jim wanted to answer. What is the best way to dramatize Tucson's plural society for the greatest possible number of Tucsones?
Things are impermanent. Things are constantly changing. Nothing is the same across time. That's one element of the Buddhist belief.
We are going to explore these issues of how the fact that there is a mediator between us and a company, which is the internet, affects our privacy issues.
So I think if we're going to be up in arms about a foreign entity trying to manipulate us, we ought to pay more attention to domestic influences as well.
Right, so that style of music, again, associated with northern Mexico, the borderlands. But the performer of that particular song is not a person of Mexican descent. It's Beyonce Knowles Carter.
About half of us have chosen to share our lives and open up our homes to the evolutionary descendants of gray wolves.
African American women's language is not Black male speech. Black women have started loving themselves loudly.
We all desire to see peace in the world, but if we truly want to end suffering, our work must be grounded in justice.
We often imagine sexuality as an identity-based word, or that it's something about our intimacies. But when we look around, we think about healthcare, when we think about marriage, when we think about public health, these are all places where our sexuality as individuals and as a group get really messy and blurry. My name's Eric Clemens. I'm an associate professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona, and I am the curator of the Downtown Lecture Series this year. And I often say, as an anthropologist, you always want to study a controversy, because that's why you know that something really matters to people.
The fingers on the dragon go snap, 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 snap. I'm Harris Kornstein, and I am an assistant professor of public and applied humanities at the University of Arizona. For the Downtown Lecture Series, I'm looking at drag, and that's something that I've looked at in a couple of different ways. One is to look at the way that drag queens perform their fabulous selves online through social media platforms. I'm interested in the ways that drag performers really trick systems. They like drag makeup and how that can be used to thwart facial recognition. I'll also be talking a bit about my work with Drag Queen Story Hour. It's drag queens, drag kings, drag performers of all kinds, reading books to children in libraries, schools, community centers. Once upon a time. So we really try to use, social justice children's literature to invite discussion about sometimes difficult topics in society.
I research early California, and so I'm focusing in particular in post-gold rush California, a time of great flux and tremendous change. My name is Erica Perez. I'm an associate professor of history here at the University of Arizona. Almost overnight, California multiplied its population, and that led to certain shifts in land use, in political power, but most importantly in social relations between those who had already resided in California and those who were newly entering the region. Because the gold rush tends to bring in much more men than they do women. Women are faced with certain limitations. And so my research and the subject of my talk is really examining some of these events that are expressed through legal cases, criminal cases, even in the media, these accounts of seduction, breach of marriage promise cases, rape cases, any number of sex crimes. I think the study of sexuality is a really serious lens from which to evaluate American history. It reveals dimensions of power and asymmetry. It reveals racial dynamics, ethnicity, and it also gets us thinking about the fact that there is no monolithic sexual culture in this country, and there never has been.
I think that we're in a crisis point since the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case. My name is Louise Roth. I am a professor of sociology, and I study gender, law, organizations, and reproduction. So one important aspect of reproductive justice is ensuring that everyone has access to the reproductive health care that they need. And of course, in the United States, not everyone has access to health care that they need. Another thing that I really want people to understand is that outlawing abortion doesn't just outlaw abortion. It has echo effects in other aspects of women's reproductive health care, like how to manage miscarriage, because healthcare providers feel that in the current legal situation, they cannot provide the care that those women really need when they're having a miscarriage. If you don't give women the right to terminate their pregnancy, there's a good chance you're also not giving them the right to make informed decisions about what is going to happen to them when they give birth.
Everybody has a sexuality and everybody has a gender. Everybody. It's just, whose do we get to talk about? I work with teachers and in communities to look at the ways in which we can make schools not just safer for LGBTQ youth, but spaces where they can thrive. My name is Carol Brochin, and I'm an associate professor in the College of Education in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies. In my talk, I'll give examples of stories from youth that I've met about what really transformative classrooms have looked like for them. I'll share some stories from teachers who have taken risks and shown up for LGBTQ youth in ways that I think other people can learn from. I believe in the power of stories to build collectives, and I hope that I can inspire some people to think about our communities in ways that they can learn to care for them and show up for them.
What makes the approaches taken by social scientists unique and engaging is that we put people at the center of the conversation. So it's not about making a point, but instead, what are the concerns, what are the issues that are helping to shape this reality, the way that we're living it? And better understanding each of those things help us better understand the problem.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Lori Poloni-Stoudinger, and I am the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona. I am so pleased to welcome you live and on stage to the 10th Annual Downtown Lecture Series. This year's series focused on sexualities and was curated by anthropologist Eric Plemons. In the past 3 weeks, we have explored the cultural impacts of drag performance, we've delved into 19th century sex scandals, and we've examined reproductive justice. Tonight, we close out this year's series by looking at how gender and sexuality are taught or are not taught in our schools. Now, before we get started, I want to take a moment for some thank yous. First, our series sponsor, Rick and Bill Small and the Stonewall Fund at the Community Foundation of Southern Arizona. Since its formation over 45 years ago, the Stonewall Foundation has given nearly $50 million to the Tucson community. Founded in 1972, the Stonewall Foundation initially funded 10 nonprofit organizations in Tucson and Southern Arizona. That expanded to nearly 20 by the time the foundation was turned into a donor advised fund at the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona. In that time, the foundation was able to provide emergency funding to many organizations that it had annually funded, and also provide special COVID funding, which allowed several of the organizations to remain viable during the pandemic. As a donor-advised fund at the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, the advisors of the fund continue to support the same organizations as before, and add several others to the annual mix of recipients, such as SBS. Annual funding from the Stonewall Foundation totals approximately $700,000 a year. Can you join me in thanking them? Also, a special thank you to our community sponsors, Joanne Ellison and Dr. Barbara Sterrett, who have supported the series since its inception in 2013. And finally, thanks to our media sponsor, Tucson Lifestyle. Can I have one more round of applause for all the sponsors? It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Robert Q. Berry III, Dean, and Paul L. Lindsay and Kathy J. Alexander, Chair of the College of Education. I'm thrilled that Dr. Berry and I started as deans at the U of A at about the same time, and I'm so happy he's my colleague. Dr. Berry's central research efforts are in equity issues in mathematics education. He is the lead developer of a mathematics classroom observation instrument called Mathematics Scan, which measures standard-based mathematics teaching practices. Dr. Berry joins me on stage tonight to introduce our last featured lecturer and College of Education colleague, Dr. Carol Brochin. Dr. Berry?
Good evening, and I am honored to introduce Dr. Carol Brochin. Dr. Brochin is an associate professor in teaching, learning, sociocultural studies in the College of Education, and the incoming director of the Southern Arizona Writing Project. Her professional and scholarly work is rooted in her experiences as a public school teacher and a literacy educator along the U.S. and Mexico border. Brochin's work is interdisciplinary, crossing and challenging disciplinary and theoretical borders while grounded in qualitative inquiry and literacy research methods. Her teaching and research pushes boundaries of what it means to do equity work, both in literacy and bilingual education. Brochin's researches and write about teacher education, LGBTQ+, and bilingual literature for youth, and crossing borders through books. Dr. Carol Brochin.
Thank you. Hey everyone, buenas noches, good evening. Thank you so much to my dean for that wonderful introduction, and also thank you to Dr. Eric Clemens for inviting me to be a speaker in this lecture series. Thank you to all the staff in SBS who have really made this possible tonight, and to my family who are here, and some family that are live streaming in from Texas. Finally, I want to thank all the teachers and educators in this room tonight. Thank you for choosing to do the work that you do, for sticking through it, especially during the pandemic. And especially now at a time when we see the drastic moves to defund public schools and even more attempts to restrict how and what you can teach. On this eve of Dia de los Muertos, I want to start to give us a moment to acknowledge our collective grief and honor those who are no longer with us. Tonight, I remember a beloved friend from Mexico, Nestor Ramirez Peña, a literary mediator and a drag queen who was one of the first queens to start Drag Story Hour in Mexico. I hope to honor our ancestors tonight with my words and with my work. All right, so this might age me just a little bit, but I want to jump right in. Perhaps some of you remember the song by Salt and Pepper from 1991 with the famous lyrics. Some of you might be able to sing it now. Let's talk about sex, baby. And really, this song is actually about advocating for sexual responsibility. And their lyrics sent messages of safer sex, especially as the AIDS pandemic was growing. And then I learned that they remixed the song in 1994 to actually talk about AIDS. In both versions of the song, they urged us to talk about sex and really challenged our beliefs around it and challenged our beliefs around AIDS, but they also helped us to think about pleasure and responsibility. So this talk is actually not about sex, but hopefully I have gotten your attention. I am going to talk about, though, the restrictive policies that shape where and when and how we talk about sex and sexuality and gender in schools. I'm also going to frame this talk around whose sex we're allowed to talk about, when we do talk about it in schools, and from my research, what I find is that what is allowed is sex and gender that is usually heterosexual, straight, between cisgender men and cisgender women. And you can't talk about sex without talking about gender. And when we as a society right now think about gender, we understand gender that has been constructed over time as boy, girl, man, woman, divided into binaries that have not always been present. And so I want us to think about, though, as educators and as teachers, about students and staff and students in our classrooms who don't fit into these neat binaries and these neat categories. How do schools make spaces for discussions about gender that disrupt these binaries and allow room for those that are in between and fluid? And so for tonight, really what I'm going to do is share some stories with you. I'll first start by sharing my own story, how I came to do this work, both professionally and personally. I'll share how coming out as a lesbian really prepared me to parent a transgender child. And then next, what I'm going to do is give you a bird's eye view of the nation, the state of the nation right now. I'll discuss whose sex and gender is at the forefront of this next election cycle and why this needs to matter to all of us. For the second part of my talk, what I'll do is I'll turn my attention to what I've learned from the youth in my research, from teachers, from classrooms and schools, where LGBTQ youth can thrive. And finally, I'll address a broader question. Why should we, as cisgender people, care about the rights of transgender and queer youth? What can we all do in this moment? I really do believe in the power of stories to transform the classrooms in which we teach, and I do hope that one day, if I haven't heard your story already, I'll have an opportunity to do so. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was raised by a Mexican immigrant mom and an American dad in South Texas. When my mom's water broke, and she tells this story often, we were living on the Mexican side in Nuevo Laredo, and my dad drove her across the International Bridge, and she gave birth to me in Laredo. It was a really common practice, especially in the mid-1970s, and especially if one of your parents was a US citizen. And so crossing the International Bridge was something that we did often, sometimes every other day or on the weekends. It was a part of our daily life. But what became routine happened as I grew older. Because of my own relations to power, right? My US citizenship, my light skin, the fact that I spoke both English and Spanish without a quote-unquote accent, I could translate between the Border Patrol agents and my family and my friends. But also my own cis body, my femme-presenting lesbian self, and my able body. Because of these reasons, I knew to take my seat behind the driver so that when the Border Patrol agents would come up to the car and ask the typical questions, I would be that first face. I knew how to answer things like no, nothing to declare, but as I got older, I became the driver, always the person between my family and my friends, and either a Border Patrol agent, a police officer,
on both sides of the US-Mexico border. What I didn't know then was the ways in which these experiences as a young girl were actually preparing me to travel through checkpoints, through international borders with others, with my people, many who experienced vastly different versions in relations to power. And I didn't realize how that was also preparing me to be a parent. Years later, I returned to my hometown in Laredo, Texas, and I taught 6th grade language arts at a school less than a mile from the Rio Grande River. I'd recently graduated from UT Austin, and I was so excited to be able to share the kinds of stories that I read for the first time as an undergrad, where I saw myself reflected in texts. I learned in those classrooms years ago why it was important to read poetry and books and narratives with Spanish and English on the pages, about border experiences, about friendships, about growing up. My students, I felt, were as surprised and transformed as I was by seeing themselves in books. And so it was in these classrooms on the border that I learned so much and found my work of becoming a teacher educator. So fast forward to a decade later, and I had become a teacher educator and a university professor. And once I started my work in teacher education, I always included and made explicit, intentional decisions to include books that were culturally relevant, to consider the ways in which culture is more nuanced, right? More nuanced than race and ethnicity, to include things like youth culture and media and linguistic landscapes and gender expressions. But for the first time in the fall of 2013, I had a graduate student refuse to come to class as a protest. She was working on her master's degree and preparing to become a high school English teacher, and we were studying an LGBTQ unit that I had assigned a very short passage from Rigoberto Gonzalez's Butterfly Boy. One evening, on a night before class, on the night of class, she confronted me in the hallway and yelled at me and raised her voice at me and told me that she was disgusted by me, essentially. And she refused to attend class for several weeks and continued to sort of send me very hostile religious emails. What this got me thinking about, though, was like, what is the role of teacher education? And what is my role to prepare teachers who have the rights to have homophobic and transphobic beliefs? How do we still prepare them to become teachers? But also, how do we prepare them to think about where those beliefs fit? And how actually public schools in this nation were founded on the division of church and state. So you have the right to your religion, right? It just doesn't belong in that public school classroom. But what made this interaction like extra difficult for me at this time is that just a year earlier, I had gotten divorced and come out as a lesbian. And at the time, my children were very young. They were 6 and 8 years old. We were living in Texas. And in Texas, like many states, people who are lesbian or gay or transgender actually will lose in courts, will lose the rights to their own children. And so I knew that I risked a lot by leaving and exiting a heterosexual marriage, but I really couldn't keep living otherwise. I lost many family members and friends, and I even lost professional colleagues, which still surprises me to this day. But what I didn't know at the time was that this was really preparing me to parent a transgender kid. My youngest, when they were 3 and 4 and 5, would try on my dresses and play with heels, and they would, dress up during playtime. And as they grew a little bit older, they got inspired by drag queens like RuPaul and played with my makeup at home. I loved them for all of these creative ways. And in my mind, I thought, okay, maybe they're gonna grow up to be a gay kid or a performer or, you know, something really to do with the arts, right? And they're obviously doing that. But what I didn't realize is that for me, as an adult cisgendered person, I was also conflating sex with gender. And so in 2014, we moved from Texas to Tucson for my job as a teacher educator here at the university. And I quickly learned about a law on the books, often called the No Promo Homo Law or the Anti-LGBTQ Curriculum Law. This law was written in response to the AIDS crisis and to further isolate and stigmatize gay sex in the gay community. It had been on the books since 1991. And although it was specifically intended for only sex education courses, it had such a broad policy implication that most teachers I worked with assumed they couldn't include any LGBTQ content in any content area without breaking the law. So then they avoided it altogether. So in some of my larger work, when we think about policy, this is the way in which policy has large, much broader implications than often what the laws are intended for. And this law also hit particularly hard because not only was it about my life and my children's life, but in 2005, I had lost my oldest brother to HIV and AIDS. And so I was really troubled by this piece, and the message that it sends to young people is devastating, that they don't matter, that they're not valued, and that their lives and their future don't count. No parent wants to see their child harmed in this way. And so in the spring of 2019, my youngest, now teenager, was in 7th grade, and we signed on to be plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the Arizona State Department of Education. We joined the National Center for Lesbian Rights and Lambda Legal, who filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of Equality Arizona to challenge this antiquated law. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the case here, in particular the part of the case that relates to my family. When their family moved to Tucson in 2014, SC and their brother, who is 1 grade older than SC, began attending a public elementary school in TUSD. This is where they learned about the anti-LGBTQ curriculum law in 4th grade, when their brother was talking about the family life curriculum and told SC and their mom that they actually weren't allowed to talk about homosexuality in the class. At the time, SC was beginning to understand both their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And learning about the law made them feel less accepted by their school. They then began 6th grade, and it was there that they experienced intense forms of bullying from classmates because of their perceived sexual orientation. SC was repeatedly called words like, quote, stupid gay kid, and others that I won't share here because they're too painful. And what we found is that teachers and school leaders were actually not necessarily very supportive in this instance. And so one of the biggest pieces behind the signing on the lawsuit, in addition to the bullying and the harassment, was really about sex education. In 7th grade, my then middle schooler, who identified at the time as non-binary and trans, was at a great school, a school that was known for being inclusive for LGBTQ youth. But even at the school that was doing their best, they continued to separate sex education by gender. And so one of the things that this got me thinking about was also the ways in which my cis male teenager also needed to learn about sex and gender about all kinds of people, right? So I think that one of the biggest issues is that inclusive, medically accurate sex education is needed for all of our students. And so shortly after the lawsuit was filed, Arizona lawmakers repealed it. It was at a time when 6 other states had these kind of curriculum laws on the books. But when I got that first call from a news reporter letting me know what had happened, it's like I got this presentimiento, right? Like a premonition or a feeling that something wasn't right. Well, shortly after the repeal of the law, I saw how the politics unfolded around local school board meetings. And so several months later, TUSD announced that they would host open forums with parents and students to discuss the changes to what they called the Family Life Curriculum, the FLC. These FLC meetings became very heated. From June to August 19th, I saw the attendance go from small, and there might be some of you in this room who were there, collectively with me in these spaces, right? And so we saw them go from peaceful, rational testimonies to full-on political spectacle. Pastors from local evangelical churches brought their congregations, mostly Latino, Spanish-speaking families and children who were actually not students in the school district. And we started to see signs sort of like the one here that you see, where young children are holding signs like, "Protect my innocence." Organizers against the new FLC were actually part of a larger coalition with a global network, including like Family Watch International, the UN Family Rights Caucus, the Protect the Children Health Coalition, the Stop the Kinsey Institute Coalition, and also at the time a group called Protect Tucson Children. Based in Gilbert, Arizona, Family Watch International claimed that comprehensive sex ed goes far beyond sex education and is a dangerous assault on the health and innocence of children. These groups depended on the medical association, the American College of Pediatricians, not to be confused by the actual American Board of Pediatrics. The Southern Poverty Law Center has actually listed the American College of Pediatricians as a hate group. And the group actually only has about 600 members who claim that they are pro-science in their attacks. So in response to these actions, a group of us, a collective of our people, we started to organize. And a group of parents, mostly those of us that parent either queer or trans kids, mobilized for an FLC that was medically accurate, comprehensive, and inclusive. And on September 19th, collectively, we decided that we were no longer going to listen to the hate speech, and we organized a walkout. We argued that the comments in the hearings violated the district's discrimination policy, which bars discrimination for reasons of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. We invited people to hold their own public forum outside of the Rainbow Walkway. And at the center of our argument was that we were not going to allow the validity and existence of the gender identity of our children to be up for debate. The forums had been co-opted to mobilize a public attack against LGBTQ community and the safety of trans youth. At the time, though, the board listened. They made some changes to the family life curriculum, but overall, they've implemented a pretty progressive sex life curriculum, I think, here. But what we didn't realize was that the local movements that we were seeing in that school board meeting were going to take on a national agenda. And so at the start of 2022, over 240 anti-LGBTQ legislation was introduced across the nation. According to trans education scholar Harper Keenan, most of these new bills targeted trans youth, sending shockwaves of fear through trans communities. Specifically, the majority of bills targeted trans girls and the rights to play sports. New headlines started to appear in the news media. Words like contagion, grooming, and panic to mobilize a larger base of moderate conservative voters. And so, to prepare for this lecture, I decided to do the kind of research that I tried to avoid for years. I'd skipped over media outlets. I learned to not read the comments. And in the past, people have asked me, how do you do these workshops with thousands of teachers when there might be people in the room? When there might be people in the room who really don't believe that you or your family should exist. And while, I think I'll live, I go back to, the metaphor in the car, right? Let me think about the ways in which I'll use my body to do this work. But this time, I did a deep dive. As a qualitative researcher, I dove deep into the far right, and I went to some really dark places online to actually understand the strategies used to build a national agenda. I read hundreds of newspaper articles, tweets, news videos, blogs, press releases, and I even attended Zoom meetings organized by groups such as the Gays Against Groomers and Mark Walsh. I compiled my data and began to code for the themes in order to understand how news outlets and tweets could build myths and launch an even larger social movement. And what I found is an entire network of dozens of coalitions, actually, that are well organized, well funded, and really ruthless. The funding is coming from groups such as X Strategies, a media and marketing team, America First, Legal, and Stephen Miller, who was a key leader in former President Trump's xenophobic and racist policies. The American Principles Project is another extremist and anti-LGBTQ group, and these organizers and strategizers were set out to create mass hysteria at the expense of LGBTQ people. And this might sound alarmist, but it's because it is. At the center of this is a man named Christopher Rufel, a self-proclaimed master strategist of the right and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank. In January of 2022, he set out to, quote, bait the left into opposing curriculum transparency in order to trigger conservative suspicion that public schools have something to hide. This led to a very prepared strategy that led into the largest siege against public institutions. But at the forward-facing was actually this idea of promoting school choice. So to some of you, this name might sound familiar because he's the same person who led the charge against the critical race theory panic and is now the same person who created the slogan, radical gender theory, with the same agenda: defund and destroy public schools as we know them. Just this past August, Rufo decided on the term radical gender theory. He set out to get the term to trend, and he did it. He did it by building a narrative that public schools are translating the principles of academic queer theory into K-12 curriculum. Each week, he landed a major news story. One week it was Portland, and that story alone generated 25 million media impressions. The plan became then to drop one news media story every Wednesday for the entire month of September. It's only November 1st. Repeating the argument that what they were doing was defending institutions, schools, and children. In 2 months, the term has taken off and become the umbrella term for queer theory. With trans youth at the center, it's actually a new slogan used to build a base from the agenda that became very clear to me. defund public schools and universities, discard academic freedom, remove credentialing requirements for K through 12 teachers. We've seen that in Arizona. And generally foster so much anger against public schools that it drove a nationwide popular movement to privatize public education. And so part of their agenda, as you'll start to see, as we've already seen, is to ban instruction on gender and sexuality in schools, to ban trans-inclusive healthcare for minors under the age of 18, to shut down hospitals, which is already happening if you're following, in Tennessee, in Oklahoma, to blame schools and teachers for turning students trans, as if we are, quote unquote, grooming them, to restrict sports to biological sex, with a particular focus on girls, making girls direct target of directed violence, and arresting parents of trans youth who affirm the gender. A major tactic of this movement has been to create these myths and allow myths to sort of take on a life of their own. And so some of these myths, and you'll if you haven't seen them already, you might. So instead of thinking about the ways that parents affirm children's gender, they're calling it child abuse. And any gender transition, they're using the words mutilation. And queer theory is radical gender theory now. Hate speech, what we claimed was a discriminatory speech, is now under the guise of freedom of speech. If this was a longer talk, we would go into that. And anything that's trans-inclusive is now supposedly erasing women. If you've been following, there's a piece of this around with Disney. And sex and gender education is now considered indoctrination. And so what I saw over the course of the last 6 months is the ways in which the strategy worked. It went from Twitter and church and nightly news directly into legislation. So in April, we saw Florida's Don't Say Gay law, the state's controversial law that prohibits classroom lessons on sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, using the research of the American College of Pediatricians. In August 2022, a Texas school district and a school board in Grapevine Independent School District passed a number of policies aimed at discouraging transgender youth from identifying openly as trans, and barring school administrations from acknowledging any gender identity other than what matches their assigned sex at birth. These school board meetings became even more heated than the ones that I participated in here in Tucson. Teachers now in this school district are actually barred from using students' preferred pronouns, even if they have parent consent. So don't let the parent rights movement fool you. It depends on what parent has the rights. This same policy also bans the teaching of anything connected to critical race theory, and it's funded by, in this case, when we trace the money, it goes to the True Texas Project, a prominent right-wing political group with ties to the Tarrant Tea Party. Most recently, on October 29th, just a week ago, the Florida Medical Board voted to ban gender-affirming care for minors. The irony is that the agenda is about returning to the rights of parents, while at the same time taking away the rights of parents of trans youth. And just last week, a good friend received this advertisement in Spanish based on her zip code, and I received the same advertisement in English because of my zip code. And according to the Human Rights Campaign, what you're seeing here is those organizations that I mentioned earlier who have spent $50 million, okay, in political ads spreading this kind of disinformation. So what we're seeing is that the ads are increasingly targeting Spanish-speaking and Black voters. The same Stephen Miller that I talked about earlier from America's First Legal spent $4 million on radio ads that are hitting 25 states just this week. It's also blanketing the states with mail. And if we look at some examples from the American Principles Project, what they're doing is they're attacking gender care and further perpetuating the lies that were and the myths that circulated on Twitter. In Florida, US Senator Mark Rubio has spent the most money behind the ads with anti-trans rhetoric, $4.3 million alone on those ads. And one of our fellow presenters who presented the first talk, Harris, has been featured in Mark Rubio's ads. And so this ad in particular was funded by the American First and the Daily Wire. At the heart of it is a man named Ferris Wilks from Cisco, Texas. He's a white Christian nationalist who has actually spent decades rallying against the larger LGBTQ community. So those larger, like, gays who are anti-trans, he's funneling the attacks against that movement too. What's important is that he's the pastor of his own church that has a Christian nationalist agenda and is founded on those 7 mountains and the areas of the movement that believe that you can control society by controlling the family, by controlling religion, education, media, entertainment, businesses, and government. And from what I have seen, they're actually being very successful at this. And so given this like national landscape, I want to transition for this next part of my talk into what I've learned from youth about what they need. What do they need in this moment? And I find that what they need is for us to show up for them in ways that we haven't been prepared for. I've shared what this larger agenda wants you to believe about trans, queer, and gay youth. But in this next section, I really want to talk about my own research. One that talks about the ways in which we need to listen to trans and LGBTQ youth. 2, I believe that we need to learn from teachers, so I'll share an example of that. And finally, the ways in which we can tell stories through books that actually subvert and counter the meta-narratives around sexuality and gender. So LGBTQ students in schools are diverse, and they come from all households, all races, all ethnic groups. They do not exist as a monolithic group. And so instead of sharing all the terrible statistics, like I feel like most of the research does, right? We know that queer and trans youth have higher rates of suicide, are more likely to drop out of school, are more likely to run away from home. But what about the kids that are thriving, and what has it taken them to do that? Because the youth that I know, they really want classrooms where they can make friendships and fall in love and have heartbreak and travel and work and do extracurricular activities. And so in this community engaged research, what I often ask them is, what do you need from us? In GLSEN's most recent national survey, the majority of LGBTQ youth reported that their classes didn't include any LGBTQ content at all. And so as one of the youth in my study says, as a queer youth, I just want people to know that we exist and we deserve the curriculum to teach us about ourselves. And so one of the things that I like to do is focus on the ways in which youth have resisted versus sharing more stories about trauma, that's youth, right? more stories about trauma and damage. So I went back to some of those district forums within the TUSD FLC conversations, and many youth gave public testimony. And here's just a little bit of what they shared. I'm still queer. I was raised in a very Catholic home. I was told my whole life that being gay was wrong, and a lot of my friends received the same messages, but yet we're still here, and we're still queer. They challenged the model that they were being groomed into being gay by schools. Another student says, I'm transgender and I was born female, but I started questioning who I was a few years ago. And I think that what we really need is education about all the different things, because you know what's confusing? Not knowing a word for it. Seeing that people are changing, but not understanding that there's something that they are becoming. And finally, another student said, identity is not a decision that I came to as an adult, it's something that I knew. And had I been taught about what it was when I was younger, I would have had the language sooner to tell the world about who I am. Instead of just telling students, hey, this is what it is, and genders are binary, it would be great if youth could hear and see themselves reflected in those spaces. But what I've also found in my research is that queer and trans youth, not all of them want to be visible. So we focus on the language of visibility, if we think about Pride Month. But given the current climate, and also if we look to history, many LGBTQ youth have always chosen to be silent. Silence has been a method of survival. And so visibility should not be the goal for all. I'm going to turn really briefly to the work of Jules Jill Peterson, a scholar of trans history and the history of sexuality, who seeks to tell the stories of trans children for our freedom. She argues that trans youth carry the light with them, and we know they won't be silenced, but she urges us, particularly those of us that are cisgender, to do the work to uplift them and give them, quote, the freedom to dream. She argues that it's time for cis people, and I would add, it's particularly time for teachers and schools to do the work so that trans and LGBTQ youth can more broadly be joyful and get a break and be allowed to be teenagers. What we know is that young people are talking about gender and sex with each other, right? They're having these conversations all the time. But those same conversations rarely enter classrooms. And so for the past decade, I've been doing professional development with teachers in schools, particularly around LGBTQ issues. And I think that because so many youth need to stay silent to survive, and so many youth also have the right to be out and proud, what is our role in this? But what I have found is that most teachers are like me. The majority of teachers have huge stressors in their lives, right? Coming out, or as in this pandemic when we've added so many burdens on them. And so teachers often come to me and say, I'm afraid to make a mistake, so I actually avoid the conversations altogether. So what I do is I allow for that space of vulnerability to say that actually we all make mistakes. It's what we do with that and how we're accountable to that when we make them. I also ask them to consider the ways in which we can build on the social justice work that they're already doing. In my case, I'm a teacher educator who spends a lot of time in bilingual and dual language schools, schools that have already thought about how we make campus cultures that are inclusive. And so part of it is just adding another layer and giving them the space to do that. And so this year alone, me and collaborators, I think some who are probably here, we've reached over 1,000 teachers and administrators in Tucson and beyond. And what's important to note is that few of these teachers are also part of the LGBTQ community, right? We often treat teachers and students as separate. But there's lots of reasons why it's hard to recruit and retain trans and queer teachers, particularly those of color. Currently, there's no national regulations or standards regarding LGBTQ-related content in teacher preparation. And over 75% of the teachers that I've worked with have never received any LGBTQ training at all. And so I want to take us into a glimpse into one classroom with a teacher that I've had the privilege of working with, Miss Lupita. This is a pseudonym, of course. And she's an elementary school teacher in Southern Arizona who was born and raised in a very traditional Mexican-American Catholic community. But one day after lunch, when she walked in with her 4th grade classroom, one of her students picked up a note. And the note read, Javi is a, and I don't want to say the word. And so Lupita, this teacher, who's a first-generation college student, had never addressed LGBTQ issues in her classroom. These were not conversations that were widely accepted within her own community or her own school. But on this day, confronted with a crisis, she had to. What she did is she gathered the students together. The students and Lupita collectively decided that the student who wrote the note would face some consequences and have accountability to the class, including writing a letter of apology to Javi. But in the days that followed, Lupita continued to reflect on how to create safe learning environments for all of her students. And you see here in her question, is that it? Will it only be an apology and then we move on? Well, for her, she first approached her principal and the principal said, nope, we do not talk about those things at our school. But with some time and a little bit of patience, the principal came around, and so did the parents in her classroom. And she took the opportunity to develop a mini tech set lesson with books around families. They read books with gay and lesbian parents, and books with trans characters, and books on the definition of love, so that they could have the opportunity to see themselves in a variety of books. So most teachers, according to the research, would have handled the situation in a very predictable way. They would have had the student apologize and keep the incident between those two students only. And what the data also suggests is that teachers are more likely to provide one-on-one LGBTQ student support rather than discuss whole class content. But what that continues to do is place the burden on the children being harassed, rather than working towards shifting the overall classroom climate. And so Lupita wanted to make a different choice. In her own words, she says, what I found for my students was that they were really able to look at changes and be introduced to issues in the LGBTQ community. They were also comfortable in sharing their own opinions, and they were able to think outside the box. Most importantly, the students were able to hear the other side of the story and put themselves in the other's shoes. They were more compassionate, and their behavior towards each other changed. And so I like to turn to examples like Lupita's to think about the ways that teachers foster classrooms where children can be prepared to stand up in instances, for example. But what she says in her final reflection is, I wouldn't have had, if it wasn't for the note, I would not have taken these steps. I hope that others who teach these topics, not just when they find a note on their desk. And so as teacher educators and teachers, we have to imagine something different is possible and not wait for a crisis to act. As a scholar who studies how to engage with children in young adult literature to foster critical conversations, One of the best ways that I think that we can do this work is through books. And so I won't have time to go through them. I could talk a whole semester on these topics, and I often do. And so I like to think about the ways in which, as we gear up for another legislative session, when teachers and schools come to you and say, again, how is what I'm teaching going to be restricted? That actually maybe they'll think about the ways in which using books, especially books about gender and sexuality, but consider other themes outside of the coded, banned words. So I like to consider the ways in which we build collections around themes of belonging and family, and friendships and expression, histories and healing and care. For example, the book Lovely, it shows a beautiful way to celebrate the ways in which we love. In this book, Families, is about a young boy who addresses his sibling and describes his responses when she told him that she was a girl. And in this book, with Citlali tiene tres abuelas, where Citlali is a young girl who actually has a grandmother who transitions. And this book is available for free online. And then I just want us to think back to the ideas of friendship. Where do young children learn about how to be friends, right? So why not come back to classics like The Toad and the Frog Together? And books about expression, right? In this case, Phoenix gets greater, and he loves to play with dolls and marvel at pretty fabrics. And really, it's through his community's help that they learn about two-spirit people. And what about books about expression that feature, in this case, a young black boy dreaming of dancing like his hero, Alvin Ailey? Or books about histories to dispel the myth that transness is a new phenomenon. In this case, the life of Graciela Irtubide, and a section about her photographs on the Muses de Uchitan, a community in Oaxaca of men and women who live as both, that has existed for centuries. Why don't we explore our history? And other themes can, especially as the curriculum gets more scripted and more legislated, why don't we think about things like bodies and love and respect and action and community? And so for this really final section of my talk, I turn to the words of a dear friend of mine, Lisette Trujillo, a fierce activist and advocate for trans youth. When she shared this image above by artist Jose Trujillo, she articulated what I had often been feeling. She wrote, "My commitment is to tethering our boats and our movements across coalition." As I shared earlier this evening, I did extensive research to understand how strategists on the far right built a movement on a very public level, directly attacking how sex and gender is discussed in schools. I also shared how the attacks are specifically directed at trans youth and trans girls. But what I really found is that trans children are the pawns in a larger movement by Christian evangelicals to defund our public schools as we know them, but also to ban abortions, protect the right of guns violence, to separate families in detention, to police black bodies, and to destroy our planet. Understanding how these political movements are interconnected will show us with whom we actually need to tether our boats in our collective struggle. What we know is that this fight is not new, but I think that how we organize it needs to be. I turn to the work of Black trans scholar and activist Yasmin Nair, who suggests that we have to organize like the right. And in order to do that, we have to understand how the right organizes. We must build a large base across multiple coalitions and several bases at once. I'm thinking, for example, of all the ways in which we connect the dots amongst our own movements. And I'll quote her here. I'm saying that if we keep focusing on who is being targeted rather than why, we're going to keep losing at this front. As long as we focus on the idea that Republicans actually care about identity in the same way that we do, we're going to keep losing the battle because all of our energy is going to be focused on one aspect of the political race for the right. And that is just one part of the picture. So it's urgent, I think, to connect the dots and move together towards liberation. The attacks on Drag Story Hour, on sex workers, on reproductive freedom, and on the defunding of public schools are all connected to the attacks on sex and gender of trans youth. I urge you to think about building a coalition and talking to the people in your own communities. One, to dispel the myths that they're literally getting in the mail right now about trans and LGBTQ youth. And I turn again to trans scholar Jill Peterson, who reminded us earlier in the lecture that trans children deserve the right to dream. In the book, Unapologetic, Charlene Cothers, a Black feminist, argues that everyone invested in collective liberation must answer the following questions, critical to determining the health and success of our movements. I've shared with you who I am in relation to the work that I do. And if we were in a class together, like some of my students here, I would ask you to do the same. Think about and share who you are with us and who you are in relation to the work that you do. But I've also shared with you who my people are. I found them here in Tucson, in this community, and at this university, our university, a public land grant, Hispanic serving Native institution on the US-Mexico borderlands that belongs to all of us. So I want to return briefly to the story I shared earlier about where I was positioned and where I position myself in relation to power. I want to ask you to consider where you position yourself and where you get positioned, whether it be a literal Border Patrol checkpoint or the metaphorical, and the ways in which we all relate to power, be it at work, in an airport, at a protest, when we confront police. Can you consider shifting seats when others with less power are struggling? How can those of us, especially those of us who are cisgendered and able-bodied, like me, leverage our own bodies? I believe that this is one of the many ways that we can learn to care for and show up for others. So I'm going to close tonight with thoughts about love and resistance. As you've heard, talking about sex and gender in schools is layered with complex political landscapes. I could end with an ask to ask you to vote, but I believe that's only one part of our collective struggle. Regardless of the legal turns and the realistic changes that will come this next election cycle, and regardless of the upcoming laws that will have direct impacts on the health and survival of my own family, I'm not gonna move. And for now, I choose not to. I'll continue to love and do the research and work with you, grounded in community engagement. I'll continue to work with teachers and schools and communities so that we can create the solidarities we need to teach and talk about sex and gender with young people. And finally, I just want to stress that if Black and Indigenous, immigrant, trans, queer, non-binary, two-spirit, and disabled people are not free, then none of us ever will be. Until we learn to leverage our own relations to power, to the right, for the liberation of all, we will never win. I wanted to make sure to share some resources. There's a QR code that will take you to a document. And if you can and are able, donate to trans-led organizations such as SAGA and the Texas Trans Futures Project and Mariposas Sin Fronteras. Thank you all so much for coming and listening, and sharing this night with me. And
thank you. Let's give Dr. Brochin one more round of applause. Well, this concludes our 10th annual Downtown Lecture Series. Thanks to all of you who have come either for one of the lectures or all for this series. I want to give special thanks to people who have over the last 10 years been our presenters, as well as to everybody who's sponsored us over the last 10 years as well. We couldn't have done it without you. This year I was also able to witness the time and dedication that the SBS staff put into bringing on these events. There was an entire team back there that give you this very professional event that you get to witness here. Special thanks to the marketing, communication, and engagement team, the tech team, and the development teams. If you could join me in giving them a round of applause, because they've put in a ton of work. So what you've seen over the last few weeks is emblematic of the type of work that we do in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I hope that you stick with us over the next few years and watch for more to come from SBS. Thank you, and thanks everybody for attending.